Hello, and welcome to this episode of Penguin Shell Personality. Today we're going to be looking at the dominant and auxiliary functions of the personality, so that should be a pretty good time. Let's look at the dominant process, and here we have the ENTP stack. So this is intuition at the top going to the right, so that's to the extroverted side of things because this is an extrovert. Then below that, you have an introverted function, so thinking. So it always goes extroverted, introverted, extroverted, introverted, or introverted, extroverted, introverted, extroverted. So let's look at this because intuition is a perceptive process. ENTPs will deal with the world in a perceptive attitude. Hence why there's a P at the end of ENTP. So an ENT prefers intuition over thinking, will consult their judgment, their thinking, only when it does not conflict with their intuition. And it goes the other way too, right? If the ENT prefers thinking over intuition, then they will be consulting their perception and they'll only consult their judgment when it aligns with their perception. So that preference of intuition or thinking is dictated by the last letter. Now for extroverts, if the last letter is a J, that means that they prefer a judgment function. So that means, for example, if it's ENTJ, as we can see here, you have thinking at the top, and thinking would be extroverted then. Because if it's an extrovert, the top function is extroverted. If there's judging at the end, the top function will be either thinking or feeling. And then we look and see, oh, there's a T. So that means that this is a thinker. So we're going to have thinking at the top, right? And it's going to be extroverted. Then below that, what are we going to have? Well, in this case, we'll have intuition because of the N, right? And the intuition will be introverted because the thinking was extroverted. So ENTP then is different because they're consulting their perception. That's why there's the P there. So they focus with their intuition, and they're because they're still extroverted though. The intuition is extroverted now. And then we look and we see the T. So now thinking is introverted and it's secondary, it's auxiliary. So even though only one letter is different, a lot about the ways this personality works have changed. So then we have this little section here called Young and the Impartial Personality. So if an individual does not develop a dominant type, all the processes will be relatively undeveloped and produce a primitive mentality because opposite ways of doing the same thing interfere with each other if neither has priority. So this is one of those examples where everything in moderation, that quote, doesn't quite work because it's not necessarily. I mean, we want to use all of our different functions. We want to use the intuition, the sensing, the thinking, the feeling. We don't want to just do one because that's not good either. But we are going to use some more than others, and that's good because you want to develop different skills. For example, let's say, just generally, take a musician. And let's say they play 10 different instruments. I mean, there's some musicians who play 10 different instruments and they will be just fantastic at all of them. Usually not, though. Usually if they play 10 and they play them all equally, they practice them all equally, that'll mean that they practice them all less. So maybe they're pretty good at all of them, or maybe they aren't, right? But they won't be as good at those 10 as they could have been at just one. If they took all that time they allocated to 10 instruments and put it into one, they'd be better at the one, right? So then it would be more advanced. Let's say they took piano and they just played piano, they would get better at it. So if you just take intuition and you use intuition, you're going to get better at it. Whereas if you're constantly trying to balance the intuition and the sensing and trying to do like both of them all the time, it's going to wear both of them down because they aren't being allowed to develop the way they should have. So that was kind of Jung's idea of it, and how being impartial could really have a negative impact on things. So then the balanced personality. So this is the difference between it's different between the balanced and the impartial personality. If the dominant process is a judging one, the auxiliary process will be a perceptive one. The opposite is also true. An extreme perceptive with no judgment is all sail and no rudder. An extreme judging type with no perception is all form and no content. So, as I said before, if you have thinking at the top for the ENTP, ENTJ, you would have thinking at the top, and then intuition second from the top. Then the ENTP, which is what we have here, you have intuition at the top, and then thinking right below that, auxiliary, right? So you have the perception, judgment, or judgment, perception, just like how you have extroverted, introverted, or introverted, extroverted. And then I really liked this quote from the book. An extreme perceptive with no judgment is all sail and no rudder. I liked that. Because perception is taking things in. It's not really evaluating them. It's not criticizing them. It's not coming to conclusions. It's just taking it in. It's just experiencing it all because you don't want to miss out on any of it, which is great to do, right? But if you do that all the time, you're just a boat moving and you aren't turning in any direction. You aren't deciding anything, and that can be bad too, right? Whereas then we have an extreme judging type with no perception is all form and no content. Now this really resonated with me because I'm a judging type. And when I was younger, I would always be trying to write books because I still love trying to write books and writing stuff. And I would focus so much on sentence structure, but I never really thought about plot. I never really thought about themes. I never really thought about characters even. I just thought about like what looks good, what sounds good. And those are important. It's important that it looks good or sounds good or whatever it may be. But if there's no substance to it, it doesn't matter, right? If you're just turning in the same spot, as a boat, with the boat metaphor, if you're just turning in the same spot, it doesn't matter if you're pointing in one direction, you've never moved, right? You've never moved forward. You've never chosen a path. You've never delved into a path, rather. You've chosen one, you just haven't moved. So now we've moved on to looking at the auxiliary process a little bit more. So this carries the burden of supplying adequate balance, but not equality between introversion and extroversion. So I already went into this quite a bit, so I won't focus on it too much. But as I said, top one's extroverted, second one's introverted. So let's look at it again. Now we're back at the balanced personality. So an extrovert who lacks introversion and thus introspection will likely be considered superficial, while an introvert who lacks extroversion will be unable to function within our society. Therefore, they have less of a choice about participating in both worlds. So this is that idea, like if you never go introverted, if you never treat yourself as an introverted when you're as an introvert when you're extroverted, you're never going to develop much of a personality. It's all going to be very surfacey because the level of depth you have will be however much you can communicate to other people. Because that's the only way that you ever get yourself across, because extroversion is all about the other. And that can be really useful. But it can also be dangerous if that's all that you ever do. Whereas then there's introversion, right? If you don't use extroversion, you can't function, and no one's ever going to see that depth that you've spent time cultivating, and that all these ideas you have in your head and all the ways you've been thinking. So don't think I'm saying extroverts can't have a depth. That would be complete crap. I hate the idea some people have where like they assume extroverts are all annoying or they assume introverts are all meek and mild. Neither of those things are correct. Extroverts are great. Introverts are great. You know, those two words, they aren't descriptors for how good or bad something is. They don't have positive or negative connotations that must be followed through with. They're just ideas, they're concepts, they have certain ideas attached to them. So, and we're all constantly being introverted and extroverted, hopefully, because that's how you function well within society and within yourself. So now let's look at an Introverts Extraversion. So in effect, an introvert's auxiliary process deals with the outer world, and the dominant process only gets involved when absolutely necessary. When an introvert has an underdeveloped auxiliary process, their outer lives will be very awkward, accidental, and uncomfortable. So this comes down again to the idea of how introverts need extroversion, and it also talks a bit about, it speaks to the type of extroversion introverts need to have and generally do have or should have. Because I mean, introversion for an introvert is always going to be the primary mode of operations. It's going to be in their own head, and that's fine. You don't have to be the extrovert. You don't have to be anything, really, right? You don't have to. And then that idea of their extroverted lives and introverts' extroverted lives being very incidental and uncomfortable if they have an underdeveloped extroverted process, I'd say we can all testify that we've met people like that or that we've been that person sometimes. Because when I was younger, I mean, teenagers are all this kind of these awkward balls of hormones and emotions. And because I was more introverted, sometimes I can be pretty awkward. I can still be kind of awkward because I'm introverted, and that's fine. But it's good to be aware of it. Okay. So an introvert's extraversion now, and a specific example with the INFJ. Unless if you are very close to an introvert or very much interested in work that they love, you are not likely to be admitted into the introvert's inner world. So I just put a specific example because I wanted to have that stack there for everybody. The personality stack, I think it's good to be able to look at that, so that's why I use the INFJ. That's the INFJ stack, just in case you're wondering about that. But then, yeah, there's the idea of you can get close to an introvert. Introverts get close to people. Introverts and extroverts, they aren't these nebulous ideas. They aren't these different scary people. They're just different. So now let's look at INFJ versus INFP. See, this is the difference when you're looking at typing and how that correlates to these stacks that are really important. And the dominant on auxiliary processes. It's different when it's introverted versus extroverted. So with introvert, when an introvert's dominant process is a judging process, they will not outwardly act like a judging person. When an introvert's dominant process is perceptive, they will not outwardly behave like perceptive people. Now, here's where this comes in, right? Because now the P in INFP is modifying the second function, the auxiliary function, because the dominant one is introverted, and the last letter describes what other people are seeing, how they interact with other people. So now, if there's a P at the end of an introvert's personality, right, that's describing their their auxiliary function. So here we have the intuition. So an INFP, their auxiliary thing is extroverted intuition. Whereas then we look at the INFJ, and now they have extroverted feeling. So the J is not describing what's at the top, it's describing auxiliary. So hopefully that makes sense, because, it's pretty important to, it's interesting at the least to know that there's that difference and that the last letter is describing how you interact with the outer world. So now, the meaning of J/P reflects only the process used in dealing with the outside world, which is what I just got into, right? That difference. Now we have a different example with the INTP and ENTP, just so you can look at that and hopefully you can figure out where the difference in how those personalities are organized comes from. Because like I said, that can be a good way of, look at that and see, do you get why they're stacked that way? Hopefully you do by this point in the video. And if you don't, leave a comment below. I'll try to clarify a bit. So next time we're going to be looking at how rare your personality type is. And just, my little mascot again, reminding you guys to like and subscribe if you feel so inclined.